So I'm going to call this session to order. I'm Rachel Hyman. You can find me on Twitter at Seltzer Princess. I retweeted a tweet with the slide, so if you want to follow along, you can just go there. A little bit about me. I live in Chicago with my Sheba Kenny. I currently work for a company called Sitter City that's making childcare finally work. I am learning how to play the guitar, very poorly at first. And I have a sticker set in the App Store called Moj, full of silly emoji like that. So, agenda for today, I'm going to start with a little bit of context, just introducing the general concept of accessibility and talking a little bit about why you might care about that. We're going to move on to Voiceover, which is what most people think of when they think about accessibility on iOS. I'm going to do a little interactive demo with Voiceover. Switch gears and move to dynamic type, and then going to get to these larger questions of why accessibility might matter. So I want to start out not by talking about accessibility or voiceover or any of that. Instead, I want to talk about the bus. I want to tell you guys a story. So I was riding the bus in Chicago where I live. We have this priority seating in the front. You can kind of see it in the lower left of that picture there. So it's seating that you can fold up if somebody gets on, like with a wheelchair or a stroller or a cart. So this lady gets on and she folds the priority seating up, even though nobody was getting on with a wheelchair. So at first, I was really confused. I was like, why fold the seats up? Isn't that taking away seating from other people that might need it? And then I realized she put the seats up to accommodate a wheelchair getting on in the future. So often it works the other way. People accommodate those with special needs after the fact. They're treated as second-class citizens. But in this case, they were being treated as a priority. So question for you guys, how many people wear like glasses or contacts? Good, fair number of you. So that's a visual impairment that society has pretty much accepted and accommodated. Accessibility on iOS is about providing accommodations like that to people with impairments, whether they be visual, motor, or of another sort. It's about treating all of your users as first-class citizens. I like to think of these accommodations as design affordances. We see affordances for differently abled people in everyday life. For instance, when was the last time you noticed a curb cut on the left there? Those make it possible for people in wheelchairs to navigate sidewalks. As a matter of fact, they make for a better pedestrian experience, even if you're on foot. Much better than stepping directly off the curb. If you have a stroller or a cart, it's transformative. Another example of an affordance on the right there is closed captioning. Closed captioning makes it possible for hearing impaired people to enjoy the same media that you and I do. But it's also important for people who may be more of a visual learner than an oral one. I use closed captioning all the time, even if it's not meant for me. Affordances like curb cuts and closed captioning help level the playing field. They make for a better experience for everyone. Accessibility on iOS is all about affordances. It's about the little things you can do to make your app usable by everyone, impairments or not. So there are 1 in 5 people in the US with a disability. That's 20% of people, of your user base, that can take advantage of accessibility improvements to your app. To me, focusing on accessibility is about empathy for these people, for people who interact with the world in a way that is different, but no less valid than you or I do. We're all here because we care about our users and their user experience. We want to make great apps that make a difference in people's lives. Accessibility is part and parcel of that. So oftentimes when we talk about accessibility on iOS, we're talking about Voiceover. Voiceover is essentially a screen reader for the system. It focuses in on different elements, like with that black rectangle up there, and reads aloud a description of that element and its features. Voiceover reaches elements on the screen through the UI accessibility protocol, so we're going to start by going through that. You'll notice first off that this protocol extends NS objects, so you get conformance for free with all UI kit classes. First question you need to answer is whether your element is an accessibility element. This will already be true by default for UI kit controls. In most cases, like if you're adding accessibility to a custom control, you're going to want to set this to true. If you set it to false, the element will essentially be invisible to VoiceOver. So we want to try to avoid that where we can. Next is accessibility label. This is what VoiceOver will read off to the user. It should be a localized string. So I have this app here called Refrigerator. It keeps track of the beverages that I currently have. We're going to focus in on that yellow view in the header there. It's a button that keeps track of my favorites, and it goes to a page where I can edit and delete those favorites. So in this case, the accessibility label is just going to be favorites. Notice that I didn't say favorites button. We'll get to that next. Also, the string is not localized here just for simplicity, but again, those should always be localized. Our next UI accessibility property is a bitmask called UI accessibility traits. Here are some examples of traits. I think of these as metadata about the element. That's why you don't want to include them in the accessibility label. It would be redundant. Note that something like the button trait isn't synonymous with UI button. You can just use it to mean element that is tappable and causes an action to ensue. I use it all the time for table view cells, and I would use it for the favorites header in Refrigerator. Next up is accessibility value, not to be confused with accessibility label. Accessibility value is for values that can change. So you'd use it like for a slider or for the number of favorites in the favorites header. If you're keeping track of that favorites value in a var, you can just hang changes to the accessibility value on didset, and it's really convenient. Last up is accessibility hint. This is an optional property for if the combined values of the other properties don't adequately express what an element does. Make sure you don't put any essential information in the accessibility hint, as hints can be turned off. So for our favorites header, the accessibility hint might just be shows favorites, but it's kind of a trivial example. We don't really need a hint in that case. A better example is of the camera switcher button in the camera app. So it might not be immediately clear what this button does just from its label, which is camera switcher. So the accessibility hint for that is just going to be switches between cameras. So that altogether is the UI accessibility protocol. These properties are the building blocks of accessibility. I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between accessibility label and accessibility value, which are properties on the UI accessibility protocol, and accessibility identifier, which is something you may have heard of. So label, value, identifier, these all kind of sound the same, but they're actually distinct. So as I mentioned, the accessibility label is the human-facing string that VoiceOver is going to read off to identify an element. And accessibility value captures an aspect of that element that changes, so basically state. So the identifier is actually not part of the same UI accessibility protocol. The identifier is used specifically for UI automation testing to identify elements. So the string isn't user-facing. You can put whatever you want in there. The converse of this is to please not use the accessibility label for testing purposes. That's what the identifier is for. If you put a testing string like button1 as the accessibility label, VoiceOver is going to read that off to the user, and it's going to be a really bad experience for people who are depending on that information. Consider flow and discoverability for your app screens. VoiceOver users are going to be swiping between elements, and therefore will discover things in the order they swipe. They're probably not going to apprehend everything on the screen at once, like a sighted user. So you may need to group certain elements on the screen together so that the VoiceOver labels make sense. I'm not going to get into too much detail, but accessibility containers are a great tool to have in your pocket when you need a little bit more control over how things get grouped together. Essentially, you specify the frame of the container and what accessibility elements it contains, and VoiceOver will group them all together. Speaking of discoverability, make sure to make use of navigation bar titles wherever you can. This is one of the first things VoiceOver reads when it gets to a new screen, and it'll emphasize that transition where it might not otherwise be clear. It's good not only for VoiceOver users, but for sighted users as well. It helps subtly establish a hierarchy of where they are in the app. So once you understand the UI accessibility protocol, you'll be equipped to go forth and do some accessibility auditing. You can't know what improvements you have to make before you know where your app stands accessibility-wise. And for this, Xcode provides a really handy tool called Accessibility Inspector. You can get there from the Xcode menu. You set the target for the inspector to your simulator or your phone and mouse over different elements to view their accessibility properties. The Accessibility Inspector tool also lets you run an audit of your app. This will find many, but not all, accessibility issues. So if we run the audit for a refrigerator, we get a whole host of issues. These range from contrast being insufficient and hit areas being too small to elements lacking a good accessibility label and dynamic type not being supported. The audit tool and Accessibility Inspector is a great place to start. It'll pick up the low-hanging fruit for areas that need accessibility improvement in your app. However, the best way to discover issues is to just do it. Take your app for a spin using Voiceover, and you'll quickly discover where things don't sound right or are hard to navigate. For instance, say we added this view at the bottom of the cell to indicate what beverage category we have. Voiceover is just going to read that out as soda, seltzer, juice, without actually indicating which is the selected category. That's not the kind of thing an accessibility inspector audit will catch, but it is something you'd easily pick up on if you were testing your app with Voiceover. So it's really important to dog food your own app with respect to accessibility. A really good way to encourage yourself to use Voiceover is to set up a shortcut. This will allow you to easily toggle Voiceover on and off with a triple click. You can set this up in settings. There's instructions up there. It's much easier than trying to navigate to accessibility settings and turn it off when Voiceover is on. Another tip is to make use of screen curtain. This is a feature that blacks out the screen but keeps it entirely operational. The magic number here is 3. When Voiceover is on, tap the screen 3 times with 3 fingers. So why would you want to black the screen out? The reason is it'll better simulate the experience of someone unfamiliar with your app who's navigating it with Voiceover. As I mentioned, this person is going to explore the app by swiping from element to element. In contrast, a fully sighted person who's using Voiceover is probably going to tap directly on various elements as they see them. So it's a different experience. The moral of the story is that auditing with Xcode's Accessibility Inspector is a great place to start, but don't stop there. Make sure you're testing your app yourself to best understand what the experience is like for Voiceover users. So to that end, I wanted to involve you all in a little demo so you can get some hands-on experience with Voiceover. Your assignment is to team up with the person next to you and take a selfie with Voiceover on. It's harder than it sounds. So here are the instructions again for the accessibility shortcut. You can get there through settings. Make sure you tap Voiceover, and then a triple click will toggle Voiceover on and off. I had a timer up here. It's not showing right now, probably because I'm not on the Wi-Fi. I'm going to try to get that going. But either way, take about 5 minutes to team up with the person next to you and take a selfie with Voiceover on. So time's up. You can triple click to turn voiceover off if you've used the shortcut, which I hope you have. So raise your hands. How many people managed to successfully take a selfie with voiceover on? Pretty good, actually. I think the first time I tried to do this, I got a picture of my knee. So you all are already doing better than I was. Yeah, the point of that was just to get everyone some hands-on experience with voiceover, and if you ran into some troubles, show that even with an Apple app, which should be best in class for accessibility, it's not always a cakewalk. So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about dynamic type. Oftentimes when we talk about accessibility, it's synonymous with voiceover, but to me, dynamic type should be just as much a part of the conversation. Dynamic type refers to type that resizes as the user bumps up font size in their settings. So typically, a designer hands you some specs. Those specs say that a label should be 17 points, and the label will stay at 17 points, no matter what the settings are at. With dynamic type, instead of setting labels at a static size, you have these styles that indicate size relative to one another. When the user bumps up font size in their settings, labels with these styles will grow, while staying about the same relative to one another. This allows you to preserve information hierarchy in your app. Dynamic type is super important. If I had to hazard a guess, I'd say there are more people making use of a non-default font size than VoiceOver. I look over on the train and see large text on people's iPhones all the time. I found that the best way to incorporate dynamic type is to get your designers on board. Start with a low-effort screen, like settings, and have them provide you specs that are annotated with dynamic type styles instead of point size. The Human Interface Guidelines includes this really handy chart that translates between dynamic type styles and point size for each different font setting. Give this to your designers. It'll help them figure out the appropriate styles to annotate with. And try to avoid putting explicit width and height constraints on labels to allow them to grow. This has the benefit of preparing your app well for localization, so a super long German word will be accommodated by labels that expect to grow, whether it's through font size or through their actual text. The Xcode Accessibility Inspector comes in handy here If you click on that third tab, you'll be provided with a scale that you can change to see how your app reacts to different dynamic type sizes. This is quite similar to how the user changes font size in settings. So I have a video here that shows the font sizes in the refrigerator app changing as I adjust the dynamic type size in Accessibility Inspector. One thing to realize is that it's not always going to be a bigger font size. Users may have a smaller font chosen in order to fit more information on the screen. So make sure you're checking how your app looks at those smaller font sizes as well. One tip here, in IB, where you set those dynamic type classes, make sure you check the box underneath that says automatically adjust font. What this does is if the user goes into settings to change their font size and then bounces back into your app, it'll adjust the font size automatically without the user having to restart. It allows you to use the Accessibility Inspector tool effectively. So up to now, I've been assuming you use the default San Francisco font in your app. If that's not true for you, take heart. You can apply this idea of styles to your custom font. I'm not going to get into the implementation details, but check out the UI font metrics class. Essentially, you create a font metrics object that specifies the font style, like body or headline, and then use that object to scale your custom font. This is a hyperlink, so you can check out the documentation for how to scale custom fonts on your own. A couple of resources for you guys. There's a really fantastic site called AppleViz where people track accessibility bugs in Apple software, specifically for blind and low vision users. This will give you an idea of the kinds of issues people are running into, even on Apple apps. There's also a directory of apps with information on their accessibility. Secondly, check out your local digital accessibility meetups. This is a great place to get connected to people who can help you test your app for accessibility. And as I said, the best way to improve your app is to get actual eyes, ears, and hands on it. So that brings me to this question. Why should we care about accessibility at all? Maybe it's been on your mind too. Isn't it just a bunch of extra work for a little payoff? To this, I have two things to say. First off, you'll notice that a theme running through this presentation is that improving accessibility makes for better apps for everyone, not just users with a disability. This is the case with adding titles to all your screens and with integrating dynamic type. These things are net wins for many or all of your users. Secondly, and most importantly, accessibility for me is fundamentally about empathy. Remember that figure I cited at the beginning, that 1 in 5 people in the US have a disability? That's 20% of people, of your potential user base, that improved accessibility can make a world of difference to. It's not nothing. People with disabilities aren't exceptional, far from it. They're humans just like you and me, trying to use apps to play, create, shop, and connect. They deserve the ability to do those things just as much as any of us. Accessibility helps level the playing field. So the point of this is not to shame anybody for not having put accessibility in their app. Rather, it's to emphasize the importance of it and to point out how many avenues there are to begin integrating accessibility into your app. It's not an intractable problem. It's something you can begin doing today. Every little bit helps. You can't always wait to be handed requirements for accessibility. Sometimes you have to be the evangelist. Hopefully this presentation has set you on that path. You can help write the playbook for your company when it comes to accessibility. So, takeaways. First, use accessibility auditing and actual testing with Voiceover to improve accessibility in your app for visually impaired users. Make use of accessibility shortcuts and screen curtain to simulate the actual experience of a non-sighted user. Second, get your designers on board and start integrating dynamic type. Tons of people have the font size bumped up in their settings and will appreciate your compliant app. Third and last, practice empathy for your users. Not everyone interacts with the world the same way, but everyone should be able to use your app in their own way. That's just good business sense and good empathy as well. Thanks. you.